Well, yeah, hello everyone. Hi, my name's Bridget Mullany. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Technology in Sydney. And yeah, in my last 6 months now, time is going quickly. And today I'm going to be presenting on some of my PhD findings. And because I can't be with you in person, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Wadi people of the Darawal Nation, upon whose lands I'm zooming into from today. And I'd also like to acknowledge my supervisors and the funders for this project. Um, Now, my project's actually focused on the Philippines. So what on earth am I doing talking to you today? Now, I am a big systems thinker, and I think that it's really important that we share findings and knowledges and insights from different sites, and vice versa. So I'm going to keep this quite high level. But just like the Great Barrier Reef, the Philippines are undergoing some serious challenges when it comes to their coral reefs, which brings me to two ACR-funded projects that my PhD has been integrated into. The first led by my wonderful supervisor, Dr. Michael Fabini, that looks at building governance capacity within local government sites. And then the second, which is led by Dr. Peter Harrison, that's actually doing the technical restoration, which in this case is larval reseeding within 4 sites simultaneously in the Philippines. Which then brings me to my PhD. So these interventions, whether they be strengthening governance or technical restoration, they're expensive, right? And conservation resources are limited. Time's running out. We've just heard that. And every dollar spent in one place ultimately means that we can't spend it somewhere else. And this then makes site selection one of the most critical decisions when it comes to coral reef interventions that governments and projects can actually make. So we've got this wicked challenge, right? How do we prioritise conservation effort in the face of climate change? And recent efforts have focused on ecological criteria, so high biodiversity, thermal refugia. But what about people, and what about people's needs and aspirations within this discussion? So the question then became for me, how do we ensure that coral reef dependent people are included in this prioritization of conservation effort? And beyond that, how do we actually identify coral reef dependent people and communities and then match coral reef interventions with ecological and social needs? Which then brings us up to speed for my study, which was to identify the socioeconomic factors shaping community dependence, to then evaluate how can resource allocation decisions be made around coral reef management so that we can guide these interventions into places where communities need them, but also there's governance contexts and governance systems there to support them. So my 3 big main results chapters looked at dependency. So what is dependency? What does it mean to be dependent? How do people perceive their dependency? And then the second, what shapes dependency? What's actually influencing people into these intimate relationships with reefs? And then the final one, which was governance, which is what I'm going to talk about today, that looks at, is there political will within sites to actually protect the futures of coral reef dependent people? Now, I did this through a transdisciplinary approach. I combined mixed methods social science with some quant indicators to investigate this, and I did that in 2 of the 4 sites that I mentioned earlier that were funded by those ACR projects. So just to flash this up on the screen really quickly, these were the Burke and Ryder indicators for dependency that I tried to use. That was a schmozzle. I flipped on that. We then did an exploratory ranking exercise with those. The social research was much more successful, which I think talks to the strengths of social research in investigations like these. And we looked at, we did focus groups, discussions, semi-structured interviews, but also looked at fish catch surveys and household level consumption data as well. So within both the sites, we saw a really high dependency on coral reefs, and that was expected, right? But this was particularly intense for provisioning services for poor and marginalised groups. But beyond provisioning services, we know that people are dependent on reefs in really, really diverse ways. And we need to kind of rethink how we think about dependent people. We also know that dependency is influenced by lots of things, including people's own values. And then they have agency to then make decisions based on those external structures and influences that are influencing them as well. But getting to the bit that I actually wanted to talk about today, which is my final chapter on governance and power, because power and power dynamics are everywhere, no matter if you're in the Philippines or working on the Great Barrier Reef. Here, the key question was, is there political will from government to protect the futures of coral reef dependent people? And to explore this, I drew on power theory, particularly from political ecology and also interactive governance theory, to try and examine what governance systems, how's the governance systems currently operating, and how is this then interacting with the socio-ecological system, and how is power shaping these interactions? So some key considerations here were to map out the development trajectories within each site and what kind of futures are already being mapped out through planning and investment and decisions into coastal development, and to also look at rhetoric, right? So who controls the narratives of what coral reefs are going to look like in the future, and who controls the narratives, and how are people who are dependent on reefs positioned within these narratives? So for Cordova, Cordova is a small island off the city of Cebu. So in this photo on the right, you can see the big sprawling city of Cebu, and those shallow reef flats in the distance, are Cordova. And because of this abundance of shallow reef flats, Cordova has had a long history of, really abundant coral reef fisheries. But because of it, they've also had developers eyeing off this area since the 1970s for coastal reclamation. And because of that, this kind of sets the political agenda and scenario within Cordova when it comes to protection of coral reefs. So from my analysis, I found that decision-making within Cordova was definitely top-down and at times also coercive. There was a lot of provincial pressure from the provincial government, political elites and developers that were really driving the agenda for coastal reclamation within the site. It was seen as something that was inevitable and something that must be done for progress. So even though it would decimate the majority of the 700 hectares of coral reefs within the area, the LGU kind of believed we had to go ahead with it. At the same time, the LGU also exhibited a pretty striking disregard for coral reef dependent people. And one of the most salient quotes from a high level official was when we were discussing coral reef, small scale fishers and coral reef dependent people at large, was that it's not poverty, because you're only poor if you want to be poor. You choose to be poor. It's poor poverty of the mind. So that kind of encapsulates the way that governance was occurring within the site. But still, because of the decentralized nature of management in the Philippines, Cordova still retains most of its veto power over its provincial waters and land, and they can change course if they want to. But alternatively, when in San Vicente, San Vicente is a rural coastal municipality in the north of Palawan, so they face the West Philippine Sea. It's historically a fishing and agricultural region and has a long history of migration from Cebu linked with the live reef fish for food trade. And then since the 1980s, tourism has been growing within the area as well, mainly centered on island hopping, coral reef diving and snorkeling. And because of this, in 2013, San Vicente was declared a flagship tourism enterprise zone. So this gives San Vicente
2 minutes left, Bridget.
national recognition of ecotourism, sorry. And San Vicente as a whole actually presents a pretty inclusive governance landscape. The local government promotes protection of reef-dependent people, highlighting their fishing heritage, and the mayor is also quite outspoken when it comes to making sure that fisherfolk and Indigenous peoples are brought along with the growth in ecotourism and the change in industry within their area. But by signing that tourism enterprise agreement, the LGU, so the local government, has actually given away most of its authority to veto resorts or developments. And so even though they have the political will to protect people and to ensure effective coral reef management into the future, they actually don't have the power now to enforce that. And as a result, we are already seeing some marginalisation of Indigenous groups who are being chased away from privately owned beaches where they used to fish. So then, why am I telling you all of this? Comparing these two sites show us that there's both challenges and opportunities in these two sites for future investment into coral reefs. So Cordova still has authority, but they also have little political will to protect dependent people and to protect coral reefs. While San Vicente has the political will, but they also have reduced autonomy under the new national tourism governance scheme that they've signed on to. So we've got these two different reef futures, right? And maybe from a pragmatic standpoint, San Vicente's governance orientation and political rhetoric appears to be more aligned with inclusive reef management, and that might make them a more promising site to move forward with when it comes to future investment into coral reefs. Yet, Cordova's no less dependent on reefs, right? And this raises some serious ethical questions about whether investments should follow favourable governance conditions or respond to the urgent needs of those who are most at risk of exclusion. And this comparison in itself really underscores our big, broader challenge, right? That effective investment into coral reefs requires attention into the interplay of power, political will, ecological significance, social significance, all of these things that we really need to be able to consider as we move forward with interventions and where we put our effort. And I know that my thesis, this is my last sentence for you all. I know that my thesis probably asks more questions than gives you answers, but I really hope that these insights get your own brains ticking about power dynamics and community needs. And ultimately, we can keep these in our minds, whether we're overseas or on the Great Barrier Reef, when it comes to, before interventions and then during interventions as well. And that'll be me done. Thanks, guys.